just wanted to say welcome to everybody who's registered for this free event tonight, and a massive welcome to Katharine for giving up her time to speak to our community this evening. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We do keep everybody who's attending muted with their videos off, so as not to disturb Katharine while she's speaking, because it can be very distracting if people keep turning videos on and off and putting their microphones on. The seminar this evening is being recorded, and everybody who's registered to attend will get a copy of the recording after the event. So you don't need to sort of scribble things down. If you hear something really interesting, you can play it back to yourself once you've got your recording. And we have had some questions submitted to us before the event. And if we've got time, then we'll take a few questions from the chat box as well. So just a little introduction to Katharine. I'm sure you won't be offended if I read it, Katharine. Katharine Cheston is a PhD researcher at the Institute for Medical Humanities, Durham University. Her research, funded by the Wellcome Trust, focuses on experience of illness that can be said to be medically unexplained. Katharine has an undergraduate degree in English and French from Durham University and a master's in English literature from the University of Oxford. She has previously volunteered for charities and organisations working with people living with complex, poorly understood medical conditions. And on the Lyme Disease UK website, you can read a blog that Katharine kindly wrote for us called "What Happens When the Doctors Don't Have All the Answers." So really looking forward to this, Katharine. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia, for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here. Just going to share my screen. Can you see that?
I'll just unmute myself. Yes, I can.
Is that all right? I don't know where it's started.
Yeah, we can see it. I'll turn my video off while you're talking, but just shout if you want to come back.
Thank you. I'll start it from the start, that would help. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to talk tonight about shame, stigma and unexplained symptoms. As Julia kindly said, I'm a PhD researcher at the Institute for Medical Humanities at Durham University, and my research is funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is a politically and financially independent global charitable foundation supporting research into life, health and well-being. Wellcome normally fund biomedical research, so people in white lab coats, but they also have a dedicated ring-fenced funding pot for medical humanities projects, and this is where my research fits in. The medical humanities, to just give a very brief overview, it's a growing and developing field of academic research which uses ideas, tools and methods from the humanities, so literature, history and philosophy, for example, to better understand and improve health and healthcare. And I'll return to the medical humanities at the end of my presentation and reflect on why I think it's particularly important in this area of research. So this is my PhD project, and the working title is Living with Complex, Poorly Understood Medical Conditions, Experiences of Stigma and Shame. Ultimately, my project asks what happens when you experience physical symptoms that medicine cannot currently explain. When you feel unwell, but medical testing reveals neither answer nor solution. I'm looking at medical conditions that are complex and poorly understood from a biomedical perspective. People with these conditions might find, for example, that doctors can't explain what's happening inside their body to cause them to feel so unwell, or that their illness doesn't show up, so to speak, on mainstream medical testing. So on blood tests ordered by the GP, for example, or on NHS MRI scans. Some people with these conditions have received diagnostic labels, such as, for example, ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, functional neurological disorder, or irritable bowel syndrome. And some people who feel that this description fits their experiences might have no diagnostic label at all. Other people, academics and clinicians, have used other names to describe these conditions. For example, medically unexplained symptoms, or MUS, medically unexplained physical symptoms, MUPS, or persistent physical symptoms. And you'll see that I put unexplained in scare quotes. And this is because I think that these terms are hugely problematic and controversial, and that they can cause people who live with these conditions to experience significant distress. I used a different term, a descriptive term, complex poorly understood medical conditions. It's a bit wordy, it's not that snappy and catchy, and it doesn't have a neat acronym, but I collaborated with my advisory group, which is composed of 8 women with lived experience. I have quite a clear research ethos. I want to work with people with lived experience as experts by experience and collaborate with them. So together we came up with this term, complex poorly understood medical conditions, to avoid words like unexplained, like medically unexplained symptoms, that sort of thing. So essentially I want to understand the somatic and social suffering that women with these conditions endure. By somatic suffering, I mean the physical symptoms, the bodily suffering. And by social suffering, I mean experiences such as stigma and shame, which people experience in society as a result of being unwell. I want to find out what causes this shame and stigma, how it feels, how it's expressed, and ultimately how we might remedy it. I'm focusing on women's experiences, people who identify as female. And this isn't because I think that these are women's conditions or that I think that men don't experience shame. It's quite simply because a PhD is only 3 years of paid research, 4 years of research, and it's 100,000 words of a thesis. It's essentially a book, which sounds like a lot, but in reality needs to be quite limited. So that's why I'm looking at women's experiences. I hope, however, to do more research into men's experiences. My methodology combines literary study with qualitative research. So this means that I'm looking at published autobiographical writing, such as memoirs about complex and poorly understood medical conditions, and I'm also interviewing women who live with these conditions, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. These are some, for example, examples of memoirs that I'm looking at. Porashista Kapoor's Sick, a memoir, which you might recognise. She lives in the US and has chronic Lyme disease. There's also Sarah Raimi's The Lady's Handbook for Her Mysterious Illness, and Paula Carman's All in My Head. And there's a couple more examples that I'll show you later. But these are all great recommendations if you're looking for something to read. I'm also, as I said, conducting interviews, and I've recently completed a survey to gather expressions of interest in participating in an interview. And seems to have really resonated with people. I received 322 responses, which was a great response and pretty overwhelming, actually. I thought I'd perhaps, I guess, give an introduction as to why I'm doing this research and why I ended up doing this. And like many people in this field, I have personal experience of a complex and poorly understood medical condition. I got ME after a viral infection in autumn 2008, which is when I just turned 15. I was ill for 8 years and was able at times to work part-time or even occasionally study full-time. I recovered, or seemed to have recovered, in February 2016, which was actually after another viral infection. But through this, I have been doing quite an amount of charity work voluntarily. From summer 2014 onwards, I worked, for example, with Action for ME in their offices in Cambridge. I worked on the ME Association's telephone helpline, and the biggest project was organising a Millions Missing demonstration in Bristol in 2016. If anyone who hasn't heard about the Millions Missing protests, we displayed shoes donated by people with ME. They'd written a small tag of things that they were missing or missing from. And we displayed about 100 shoes on College Green in Bristol, and it received quite an amount of media attention, and it was quite successful, and certainly had a big impact on my thinking. Through this, I realised that I was not the only one to have suffered as a result of other people's misinformed beliefs, to have felt stigmatised, as if my diagnosis marked me out as different or made me a target for judgment. For some people, these experiences were perceived as more upsetting than their severe physical symptoms. As writer Dorothy Wall, in her memoir Encounters with the Invisible, writes, she says, "It's not the disability that's the greatest burden and source of grief. Sorry, just finding the full quote. It's the reaction of others that is most devastating. The barriers erected through stigma, misunderstanding, rejection. This stigma can be intensely distressing, and living with stigma brings other challenges, such as shame, which has been described as the emotional response to stigma. We can all, I'm sure, recall instances when we felt ashamed, when we felt the blush on our cheeks, and we perhaps wished that the ground would open up and swallow us up. But these are could perhaps be described as acute instances of shame when we've done something embarrassing or felt really intensely embarrassed. But what I think is happening as a result of living long-term with stigma is something called chronic shame. Chronic shame is a relatively new area of interest of academic research. Chronic shame is insidious. It can seep into our lives without us realizing. Chronic shame says it's all my fault. I'm unworthy. I'm a failure. I'm bad. There's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong about me. It can cause feelings of intense loneliness, making us feel that no one understands or that even no one cares. Chronic shame, as it sounds, impacts all areas of our lives, and it can even affect our health. Academic Luna Dolezal, she's a philosopher, and clinician Barry Lyons have described chronic shame as an effective determinant of health. So they mean that shame is detrimental to our health. Shame leads to poorer health outcomes. Shame makes us sick, basically. I can illustrate this with an example from my own life. In December 2009, I got a sore throat, and it went on for weeks. It's still there 2 weeks later. I didn't want to go to the doctors because I knew which letters were on my medical records. I didn't want to be seen as a nuisance. I'd had pretty traumatic experiences with medical professionals before, so I didn't want to have that again. And after all, I thought, it's only a sore throat. Little did I know that untreated tonsillitis can lead to scarlet fever and reactive arthritis, which is a little bit like rheumatic fever, but less serious. Which are diseases that I thought were from the 19th century and left there. But anyway, I was very unwell, and all my joints swelled up. And for 3 months, couldn't get up the stairs, couldn't open doors. And yes, it certainly led to poorer health outcomes for me. But, I didn't recognize my own shame. I'd spent at this point 18 months reading and writing about shame, and I didn't recognize it. So if I didn't recognize my own shame, and I'd spent so long thinking about shame, how, I wonder, can we access these experiences? The first strand of my research is focused on language. I've asked what language we use to talk about these conditions, bearing in mind that there's no accepted biomedical or scientific language or narrative a lot of the time. I'm trying to find where shame hides, how it's expressed in language. Shame lives in the dark. Shame makes us want to hide. Shame flourishes in darkness and being hidden. So I believe that if we can find it, if we can find how it feels, study how it's expressed, then we have a better chance of bringing it out to the open, into the light, so we can find ways to improve these experiences and hopefully relieve these really intense, horrible feelings of chronic shame. So I've been looking at the metaphors we use to talk about these experiences of illness and shame. We often use metaphors to talk about illness. For example, how often do we hear someone talk about cancer as a fight? They're fighting cancer, their fight against cancer, or our collective fight against cancer that happens with scientists in labs. These conditions, complex and poorly understood medical conditions, don't share the same metaphors. It's probably hard to find to fight, in some instances, an enemy that you don't know what it is. But there are particular metaphors that I see time and time again. And I'm going to talk through very briefly a couple of these examples in the memoirs. Just I hope that might be interesting. The first one is evoking the experience of complex, contested, poorly understood illness as if going to a different land. And this is not just a new space that we can imagine. This is the Shadowlands, a very dark space that seems quite unknown. And this is Julie Ray Meyer's memoir here, and this is the front cover, which I think does a good job of expressing what this is. Anna Lindsay, who wrote Girl in the Dark, which is a memoir about a rare an unexplained light condition, light sensitivity condition. She describes her condition as being released into the wild healthcare borderland, a trackless and confusing country where what signposts there are point in multiple directions, sat-navs fall silent, and strange beasts roam, which I think is quite a good image. So even in popular culture, in music, Belle and Sebastian, which is I think Glaswegian indie band, their lead singer lived with Emmy for many years. I think perhaps might still have Emmy. And one of the lyrics in this song, Nobody's Empire, is "We're out of practice, we're out of sight, on the edge of nobody's empire." So it's a real new space, right on the edge, space that perhaps isn't mapped, isn't well known. So what do these metaphors mean? I guess I think they convey some of the isolation and loneliness, the lack of help, support, empathy, care. This is nobody's empire. These are a wild healthcare borderland, places that people aren't interested in, perhaps. I think it also conveys something of the life-changing experience. It's not as if, it's as if you've moved to an entire different land, such as the life-altering effect that it has. Other metaphors that are repeated are expressing shame and stigma in relation to these illnesses as something that physically stains or sticks to the skin. Julie Ray Meyer, in her memoir Through the Shadowlands, refers to her illness, chronic fatigue syndrome, as a mark of shame. She also writes, "The only thing calling my illness chronic fatigue syndrome seemed to add was a stain of stigma, as if the name provided a window into my soul and displayed some moral failing within me." A stain of stigma, this repeated S sound. I think that's quite a strong image. And these images are often evoked in the medical settings in terms of medicine and in terms of diagnostic labels, as if these things are staining us and sticking to us. Anna Lindsay also writes about talking to other people who are also chronically ill. Like me, she writes, they had a life before that has been lost. Now they wander in the twilight zone where doctors diagnose but cannot cure, and the faint miasma of societal suspicion, never attached to those with cancer or with heart disease, hangs about them, that somehow it must all be psychosomatic, or that at a deep level they actually want to be ill. This is a faint miasma, like a faint mist, something that's palpable, something we can touch, we can see, we can perhaps even smell, is attached to them all times, it hangs about them, marking them out, something that they can't escape from. And I think that these metaphors really show, they make this feeling such a shame and stigma visible on the skin, as if to show what a big impact that they have on people's lives, and just how insidious and all-consuming these experiences are, how they stick around you. It's something you can't get away from. I'm also very interested in seeing if these metaphors are reflected in everyday speech and conversation. So, like I said, I will be conducting interviews, which I'll make into transcripts, which I'll then compare to the literary texts, and hoping to publish more on this. So we'll certainly put that on social media when it is out there. I'm also hoping that interviews will allow me to diversify the voices that I'm hearing beyond those whose health and wealth permit them to write and to publish their stories. Obviously, we all know that not everyone can do this. So if I may now conclude with pinching some words from Jennifer Brea. This is her TED Talk, which is entitled "What Happens When You Have a Disease Doctors Can't Diagnose." It's on YouTube, and this quote starts from 15 minutes, 56 seconds, if you want to access that. Jennifer Brea is talking about her own experience of ME, and she says, "Even once the true cause of my disease is discovered, if we don't change our institutions and our culture, we will do this again to another disease." And this is something that has been on my mind for many years too. I think especially now with the advent of long COVID. In the news this morning in The Guardian, I saw an article about how they'd found autoantibodies in people with long COVID, obviously a post-infectious syndrome that to me seems very like what I called ME for many years. So even perhaps when long COVID hopefully helps us discover ME, in some people's experience of ME, we still need to change. What are we going to do when the when ME or whatever it is, we have an answer for that, there are still other conditions that don't have these answers and are still going to be tainted and stained by stigma and shame. This is where I think that the medical humanities can come in. People talk about first and second order change. So first order change works within the existing structures and systems. You know, it makes small tweaks, minor adjustments, small improvements. So for example, moving one condition from unexplained to organic, recognized condition with a narrative that we know what it is, we can do a blood test, we can find out what those people have. Second order change is really transformational. It's radical, it's revolutionary. It requires us to rebuild the systems and structures from the ground up, and it requires us to adopt a different worldview. This would be the case if we really, I think, listened to people with lived experience. The medical humanities seeks to put those with lived experience at the centre of research and listen closely to their stories. I feel that this is what's necessary, and perhaps leaning on things like long COVID, allowing us to show just how wrong, I guess, we've got this, and just how much harm has been caused to people, and how much of that has gone on behind closed doors. I'm hopeful that through leaning on these experiences, such as a pandemic, through the medical humanities, through our charities, that this could allow finally for second order change. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to hearing your questions and your comments, and please do get in touch at any time via my email, which is on the screen, katharine.a.cheston@durham.ac.uk, and I'm also on Twitter at @KACheston.
Thank you, Katharine. That was so interesting, and I'm sure everybody who's listening this evening will resonate with everything you've said in some way. And it did take me back to a point in my life where I was diagnosed with ME for a long time, although I didn't really fit the criteria for it at all. And you mentioned that you worked for Action for ME for a little while, yeah. And I used to receive their magazine monthly, I think it was, or quarterly. And somebody wrote a very powerful poem in one of those magazines, which I've still got. I can't quote the whole poem. I should have probably found it before, but I found it very powerful in respect. At the time, my first marriage was breaking up because of my illness. And somebody wrote a poem, and basically the two lines that stick with me forever. And it was basically saying to the person, whether that be a husband, a wife, a friend, you're walking away from me, but you keep looking back. And then the next two lines were, I have joined the land of the sick. I have learnt to speak the language. And that still resonates with me today. And I actually use that poem during my marriage breakup just to show that to my husband, to illustrate what was happening. It was a very powerful moment, but your talk actually brought it all back. And that's not a negative thing, that's quite a good thing, because I was able to have a piece of paper and say, this is what's happening to us. And you can understand, then the other person can understand. And I know lots of people in our community, their friendships disappear, their relationships disappear, and it can be really tough, can't it? Really tough. I'm sure through your work you've explored those issues. So yeah, that's, thank you. That was really good. Thank you. So we've got a few questions, which some of them you will have covered in your talk, but so somebody's asking, what illnesses does your research cover? And obviously it covers ME. Are there any other illnesses that you've included in your work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, ME is obviously close to my own experience. Equally, a lot of the memoirs deal with ME. It's the most common diagnosis. Whether or not that is their diagnosis at the end of the book, it's often, you know, replaced or post-publication. I found out that Julia Ray Meyer, whose Shadowlands book I quoted, has now been diagnosed with CCI, craniocervical instability. I don't quote me on that, but a different condition.
She has, and she's surgery.
So I mean, it's very common. However, complex and poorly understood medical conditions, I'm really just, I guess, with my survey, for example, I put the definition that I'm using, how I define this, something that doesn't show up on medical testing, or that doctors can't explain all of their symptoms, and just allow people to really see if that fits with their experiences or not. There might be some people with some diagnoses, for example, who don't feel at all, who feel that they have an explanation that fits with their symptoms. I guess long story short, lots of conditions: ME, functional neurological disorder, IBS, post-viral fatigue syndrome, all sorts, and people are able to add themselves and opt in, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, I guess where we would all hope that at some point many people with chronic illnesses, whether it be ME, whether it be Lyme disease that wasn't diagnosed quickly and went on to become a long-term illness, you name it, there's quite a few connotations that, you know, at some point doctors start to look a bit further, because as you mentioned with Julia, the book The Shadowlands, is that some people with neurological problems, why is it until only very recently nobody thought, could there be something wrong with their cervical spine, which houses all the blood vessels and nerves, and that's an aspect that is becoming, you know, it's still hard to convince the medical community, but you know, some people are making a recovery from that. So but that's it, is do doctors look hard enough sometimes, if you know what I mean? Let's hope that through long COVID as well, and through researchers like yourself, you know, some parts of the medical profession might say, are we missing something? Hopefully.
Yeah,
hopefully. So somebody's mentioned long COVID here, and I think you've answered this. How do you think that the thousands of new cases of long COVID emerging might change the situation between medics and patients? At the moment, lots of people in those cohorts of different illnesses are met with disbelief and shame. They feel shamed because, you know, the doctor dismisses their thoughts completely. So do you think personally that long COVID could change that relationship?
Yeah, I really hope so. And I think that there is great potential for this to change, especially I would love at some point, if I'm able to gain more funding after my PhD, to research post-infectious illnesses and the history. I think that long COVID really has the potential to bring post-infectious illnesses, which may include some people. Obviously, I'm not labelling or including people in this without their consent, but chronic and post-treatment Lyme disease alongside in this category of post-infectious illnesses. And I hope that perhaps that might show just how wrong we've got this in the past, post-viral syndromes, that this has been classed as effectively a behavioural disorder rather than, you know, potentially autoantibodies are misfiring or your body's effectively attacking itself. But I think that this change won't happen automatically. I think we need, as people with lived experience, as researchers, as people in charities, as people on social media with a Twitter account, we need to put pressure on this to allow long COVID to make the change that we want to see. I think otherwise the opportunity could go without this great change. I think it's going to need a lot of action to put pressure on the opening of long COVID, if that makes sense, to create this change.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I have noticed through my own personal Twitter account that there are some scientists, one of them that I follow, who has long COVID herself, who is speaking up for other post-viral conditions, post-bacterial conditions, because who knows, at the end of the day we might find out that it's all the same thing. But like you say, it's going to take people like yourself, people like ourselves as well, doctors who are now experiencing long COVID. And I've also started following, I'm not sure if you have, there's a group now, Doctors with ME, who I read one doctor's account that he decided to retire early rather than tell his colleagues that he had ME, which is a shocking reflection on the medical profession, really, isn't it? So, you know, like you, I'm hoping that with time and pressure, you know, we might move on a bit from the shame and the stigma.
Absolutely.
So what do you think doctors can do to improve the doctor-patient relationship with those with chronic illness?
I think one of the most interesting parts of my research has been to look at shame more generally, and to look at the defences to shame. When we feel ashamed, we can either attack, I mean, there are 4 defences to shame, one theorist says, and one of them is attack self or attack other. When we feel shamed, we feel threatened. We want to put that shame onto someone else. And I think that there's a great project actually on shame in medicine called the Shame and Medicine Project, which is run out of the University of Exeter and I think the University of Birmingham. Very happy to pass that email on to anyone or the website. But they're looking at doctors' experiences of shame and how shame functions in medical training. So that in many ways, perhaps it's a great shame on doctors to have to admit their lack of knowledge, to have to admit that they can't cure someone. But I think that that's what they need to do. They need to take on that shame without, perhaps, I feel like in many ways I've felt as if doctors have put that shame onto me and blamed, you know, shame and blame are so connected. But to accept that it is not shameful to have to admit your lack of knowledge. This is part of our human condition, to be able to say, I guess, I don't know. And I think that great uncertainty, to have to live with that uncertainty, to cope with the unknown, is a great responsibility of the medical profession. I think that if I could change one thing immediately, that it would be that, to accept and hold that uncertainty without putting the blame onto the patient, working with them through the uncertainty.
Yeah, belief that I may not understand what's going on with your body, but I believe you when you tell me, you know, the symptoms or how you feel. But that's really lacking at the moment, and we really have to move on from the days of the doctor knows all, because, you know, they don't. Nobody can know everything, can they?
No, absolutely.
And particularly post-viral conditions like Lyme disease. I actually ended up in A&E about 3 or 4 weeks ago for something completely different. And the doctor who I saw a doctor straight away. I was fast tracked because they thought it might be connected to a vaccine blood clot. It wasn't, but the doctor briefly went through my history, and his first puzzled question to me was, "What is ME?" And he wasn't a junior doctor. He was quite senior because of the reason I'd gone in. And I just sort of looked at him and said, "It's a neurological condition. It's well known." And he just looked at me as if to say, huh? So this is 2021. You know, I've been in this heartlands of illness for over 20 years. That hasn't changed. You know, I couldn't believe it when he said it. I couldn't believe it. So yeah, we have to make progress. Why did you choose to look at the experiences of women in particular with your research?
Yeah, so this was a bit of a tricky decision to make. It was basically made because of the limitations of doctoral research. You have to sort of limit your area, because it's not as, I guess, not as big as it sounds. 3 years of paid work and 100,000 words of an eventual thesis kind of book project. Also because men don't write memoirs with the literary aspect of I can find only 2 memoirs written by men. Perhaps that says something about shame, but unfortunately I just didn't have the material to include men. So I would love, as I said, to look later at men's experiences. And it's certainly not because I think that they're not ashamed or that they're not important, or that they don't have difficulties. As I've received quite a few questions on this slide, and yeah, I wish I could include men's experiences.
There's always constraints on any research project, whether it be money, time. So it would be interesting to see what you follow up with next. How do you think our patient community, in our case, obviously we're a Lyme community, how do you think our community can help support your work and help raise awareness of the subject you're researching in general?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think researchers like myself, speaking from my personal perspective, I always welcome discussion. I welcome those emails. I welcome people.
Somebody has shared their screen. Could you stop sharing your screen, Zilla Stevens, because we can't hear Katharine while you're sharing your screen. I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, yeah, back.
I'm muted.
You're back.
I'm back. Yes, I really welcome discussions, sharing. I really want to work with people. Obviously, I've set up my advisory group. And they have a very big role in my project, but also welcoming these more informal discussions to shape my research. So please get in touch, please, on email, on Twitter. And I think that other researchers, especially in the medical humanities, really appreciate these discussions too. And obviously sharing publications, sharing blog posts, getting discussions going, I think is really important.
It would be really great if, I know obviously your time is very precious, but if maybe you could follow up with us in a few months and do, see where you are, and maybe, would that be good?
Yes, no, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, I'm sure people would appreciate that. So let's have a look what else we've got here. So this is an obvious question, but nice to hear it in your words. What are your hopes for how patients with chronic illness will be treated and supported in the future?
I think quite simply to be listened to be believed, to be kept at the heart of decisions made about their own treatment, their own care. I think also, we talk often about the clinical encounter, as we call it, the doctor-patient relationship. But what's really important too is in research, in big studies, for example, there's the Decode ME study, which is working with patients are on the board, people with lived experience, and they're there as experts, so they're on the same level as the researchers. And this is really key. Enough of the research that uses people, that's almost parasitical, that feeds from the people with the lived experience, but does not give back, but does not have that open discussion. I think this is really key. It's really key to have this equality and balanced relationship between doctors and patients, but also between patients and researchers. Just so that the research that's done, the money that's spent on research, goes to where it's needed to be, goes to where people want it to go. It seems quite obvious, but it hasn't, I know, especially in ME, I suspect in chronic Lyme and other conditions too, hasn't been the case for many years, certainly.
Something that you mentioned during your talk that is something that we just accept in, to do with healthcare. You mentioned that, for instance, cancer sufferers are portrayed as fighting the disease, and then sadly, if something happens, they've lost their battle. Is that an unhelpful phrase? Because obviously everybody's fighting their illness, and some people have won their battle. Does that mean the people who haven't won their battle have somehow failed? Do you think it's an unhelpful label?
Yeah, I do. I think that, there's some fascinating research that's going on, I think in Lancaster, by a researcher called Elena Semino. And if anyone wants to see it or to talk more about it, please get in touch. I'm happy to discuss that, send you links. And she's looking at metaphors for illness, and she looked at metaphors for cancer and found the battle metaphor, the war metaphor, the fighting, and then also the journey metaphor, which was more acceptance of relapses, of treatment not working quite as we want, and perhaps isn't so much of a judgment on our character. The losing the fight is I personally don't find particularly helpful. But I mean, some equally, it's there for a reason. People clearly like this metaphor. So yes, personally, I think it's problematic. But I wonder why it's still there, basically.
I must admit, I agree with you, because it's almost as if that person with any illness doesn't get better, they've somehow failed, they haven't fought hard enough. And I know that I've seen, from our community, people being very disheartened by family or friends' comments, implying that they're not trying hard enough. And I think that comes from there, doesn't it?
Yeah,
that comes from the battle, and whether you win the battle or not. It's a very hard thing to take in chronic illness, when people are often battling just to, for instance, get out of bed in the morning, which you've probably experienced with your ME experience. So yeah, very difficult. I agree with you totally. I don't think it's helpful. So what else have we got here? I'll just check with the girls who are moderating to see what's in, so we can take a couple of questions from the chat box as well. If anybody's got any questions, please put them in the chat box, rather than putting your hand up with the reactions at the bottom, because we've got all the videos and microphones muted. So do put your questions in the chat box if you can. Let's see. Hang on, there's a report here. So somebody has asked this question, which is quite powerful. Should we start using the term post-infectious disease and come together as one big force so that we have a bigger voice?
I've thought about this myself, especially with various discussions on Twitter. I think also it might help with a sense of community. I think I've seen this with discussions between people with long COVID and between people with ME, when there's almost, given that there's not much legitimacy in a medical sense, it's almost that people are fighting between themselves to define the true ME, the true long COVID, what's more important, what's more serious. I think it might help in that respect, certainly, to have this large community. I guess, as some people have been saying with the term long COVID rather than the term post-viral, in that it might be that the virus is there still somewhere, or the infection. So I guess there's people have an issue in the long COVID community, and I think in academic work I've read with the label post-infectious, post-viral, in that it might not be correct. But personally, I think this is a great idea, and then having the strength in numbers, I guess, and certainly similarities in experiences, even if individual experiences are individual. I certainly think that could be a good force, especially for lobbying and for policy.
Yeah, especially for lobbying. I mean, obviously through social media, the ones of us who follow sort of mainly Twitter is where you get the most conversation, and certainly the ME community have stepped up to try and support long COVID sufferers. But like I said before, there's a few people, including post-bacterial, whether we are post-bacterial, or I know one of the fairly well-known Lyme disease consultants has started using the term long Lyme.
Yeah.
Because, like you say, one big voice for lobbying has got to be stronger. You know, maybe that's a route we all have to go down. And the argument about whether it's post-infectious or infection still there, you know, that it gives us a whole voice, doesn't it? Whatever the conversation is about, is it infection or in long COVID, is it still the virus, is it post-viral? But if we all use the term long Epstein-Barr virus, because a lot of people start ME with Epstein-Barr virus, don't they? So that's quite a good point, isn't it?
Yeah. I guess retaining our voices within the conversation about long COVID. I've been personally very upset by this idea of long COVID as a completely new disease. Yes, it might, COVID-19, obviously SARS-CoV-2 is a completely new disease, but actually people like me, like probably many of you here perhaps, have had an experience of getting a virus, getting a bacterial infection and not getting better. And we matter too. I think it's important to keep our voices in this conversation. Absolutely,
because the whole, what we need to get to the bottom of is why, whatever started that illness off, whatever, why a certain amount of people never get better. That's the bottom line, isn't it? It's not about my illness is better than your illness or your because you hear all that, don't you?
You do.
And, you know, I think it's quite sad when you pitch different patient groups against one another, because none of us are going to win with that, aren't we?
No, exactly.
But yeah, let's hope that long COVID does open some doors, if not answers straight away.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me just have a look if there's any more here. You did cover them quite well. So somebody was asking about the sort of research Wellcome Trust sponsors. So is the sort of research similar to yours that they sponsor, or is it all kinds of research?
I think their tagline used to be something about research that improves health. You know, we fund research that improves health. I mean, most of their research is in science, biomedicine, and most of the money goes there because these projects obviously need big kind of lasers, cameras, computers, all that sort of thing, microscopes. But yes, they do fund medical humanities projects too. And my dream is to have a big Wellcome funded project with sort of many team members looking at complex poorly understood illnesses, kind of across centre, across university, with lots of disciplines in one, really getting to the heart of this. They've done similar projects with voice hearing, similar projects with breathlessness. So yeah, that's the aim eventually.
How do you feel about, so this affects ME sufferers, it affects Lyme disease sufferers, post-viral sufferers in general. How do you feel about psychology having a big voice in that argument? And at the moment we have a quite an eminent infectious disease professor who claims to have gone from having long COVID to curing himself with positive thoughts and going for a 10-mile run and all sorts of things, and yet that person has a much bigger voice than a lot of people.
And I mean, I read that and just, you can sense the fear from this, and when we feel fear, we attack, we reach out, we can, you know. And this is what society wants to hear. Society doesn't want to hear, I got a virus and I was ill for the rest of my life, or I got a virus as a teenager and it ruined my teenage years and traumatized me for life. you know, quite bleakly. They don't want to hear those stories. They want to hear, I got better, I can accomplish everything, I can disarm the disease. You know, these are the narratives that people like hearing. It's very hard to get them to hear stories that make them consider their own vulnerability. We're all vulnerable, we all have bodies that we have, we can all get ill. And that's not a reflection on our character and on our strength. You know, it's just because we have the bodies that we have.
But a phrase that covers the whole spectrum of chronic illness is, you don't get it until you get it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I think with the role of psychology, personally, I think that there is a place for supporting people with this massive life-changing condition. I know that I found experiences of being ill deeply traumatic, deeply difficult, happened when I was young, or very distressing. I think there is a place if people want that help. But what I would like to see is psychology being involved if people want it, and it might happen later. You know, it might happen many years later for them to access that. But this should not be the first point of call. We shouldn't just lump someone in with psychology, with psychiatry, because we don't understand what's wrong with them. You know, there should be this area that you have to live with the uncertainty of what's wrong, and just listen to what they want, and listen to what would help. So no, I don't like this the main role that psychologists had in these conditions.
It's very difficult, isn't it? I do agree with you that I think some interventions can help in some, like, personally, speaking for myself, I got to a really bad place because nobody could understand what was wrong, and most of the people who know me well know that I was a health professional, and it was very difficult to suddenly go from a respected health professional to somebody who was obviously making symptoms up because nobody could understand, you know, and that, like you said, takes you to a very dark, low place. And despite, you know, what we've said about psychological interventions, it was actually, strangely enough, a very experienced community psychiatric nurse who didn't improve my condition one bit physically, but went away and did some research at that time about ME, because I didn't know at the time what had caused the illness, read the book from cover to cover, and came back to me at my next appointment and said, look, you know, you're actually not depressed, or you certainly don't suffer from anxiety, because I could be quite, you know, articulate in what I was saying. But she said, and I think this ties in with your talk, you are grieving for the old you. And until you grieve, you can't move forward. And in actual fact, she did help me grieve, and I did move forward, not physically, but definitely I moved forward. So in that respect, you know, I agree, but I have the same feelings as you about people professing to, you know, if you do certain things, you'll be cured. And I certainly won't be going for a 20-mile hike or whatever it was the guy did to see if I'll get a bit better. But yeah, it's so interesting. It's such a complex mixture of the physical, the emotional, and many people end up with a type of post-traumatic stress, the way they've been treated by the medical profession, because you can only take so much of being told, you know, there's nothing wrong, or the scans don't show anything, the blood tests are normal. Well, I would say, well, we haven't got the right test or scan yet.
Exactly. I would say that too.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered all the questions, and we're nearly at 8 o'clock. So I'd really like to say massive thank you, and really hope that if you would like to come back in, I don't know, a good time frame that you suggest, and we, you know, people can listen to you speak again, and that would be absolutely brilliant. I'm sure people have got lots of questions, and even if we haven't answered them today, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, and I'm at the media@LymeDiseaseUK.com email, I would certainly pass any questions on to Katharine for people, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll just put my email as well in the chat box, and my Twitter. My DMs are open on Twitter if anyone wants to email or tweet, or as you say, get in touch with you and have it passed on.
Yeah, one way or the other. People are welcome to.
Absolutely.
I'm happy to pass stuff on. So I'll just have a little check through the chat box as well while you're doing that. Have you got all your details in?
Yeah, put the email address and the.
Okay. Can I just ask you one question to finish, which we often use as a last question to speakers? What would you say to people who feel completely hopeless about their situation? How can they, what can they do to move on from this hopeless, horrible feeling that lots of people have?
I think, if I might speak from my own experience, it's very easy for people to say, hold on to hope, it will get better. That didn't particularly help me at times. I think what did help me was understanding that other people were going through similar experiences to me. And I did read lots of memoirs, I read lots of books, lots of blogs, lots of social media posts, surrounded myself with other stories, which helped me to feel like I wasn't alone, and importantly, like it wasn't my fault. I think there's a lot of blame and a burden of shame and blame and fault that people can carry around, and that helped me to know that that this was a situation. If we might talk about the Shadowlands or this other landscape, that there were other people there with me, and finding and connecting with them helped me to sort of make sense of that sense of hopelessness.
I think that's really important, isn't it? That we reach out to other people and other people reach out to us, and social support, which is often dismissed by the medical profession. If you dare share that you belong to a Facebook support group, roundly or either ticked off or ridiculous. But in actual fact, it plays a massive role, so people can speak to each other honestly and in safe environments.
Definitely. And perhaps also, I think I've been very encouraged by the response that my research has got in an academic, in a university and academic world. I've gone to conferences, I've spoken about this, lots of different events in lots of different situations, and people have only been sympathetic and empathetic and shocked by what they're hearing, that they had no idea. I've talked to people who are doctors, and people, professors. There are people out there who are seeing people, who can see through this, and who care deeply, and it's got a much better response than I thought. So I think that is very encouraging, and I wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I'm sure most people will take that away from this talk. Well, we've run out of time, but thank you honestly on behalf of the Lyme Disease UK team. Love to hear you speak again, and thank you to everybody who's registered. It's been a really, really interesting talk, and what can I say? Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great. It's been a real privilege.
I'm going to close the meeting now, but as I said at the beginning, everybody who's registered will get a copy of the recording, and hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you, Katharine.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.